So a lot of board members are now asking their leadership teams, how are they going to adapt to the impact of AI on their workforce plan? And a lot of leadership teams are still trying to figure out exactly how to go about this. Well, actually, what I'm going to do today is the first in a 4-part series, which is walking you through the full end-to-end process for how to actually measure the impact of AI on your team and how to then go through the process of reallocating the resources such that you can adapt to the impact of AI and which roles are potentially ripe for automation. And so we're going to look at total number of hours saved rather than the number of people we're going to lay off. And I think that's a really important framing, and I'll walk you through exactly how to do that and why to do that over the next 4 sessions. Today, we're actually going to focus on something you can actually do yourself immediately, which is as a HR or talent acquisition leader to actually look at the automation impact to your own particular role. And so we're going to go through a sample job description, and we're going to look through all the different tasks within a recruiting function, and which ones are potentially ripe for automation, which ones need a copilot, which ones are going to stay human driven. And then we're going to see how that impacts the overall planning for the team and how we potentially communicate that back to the board. So let's jump into it. So if you are going to download the resource pack from the Talent Academy, you'll be able to find the task scoring prompt pack in here. There's also 2 more files that we're going to cover today. One is an Excel file, which is actually walking you through the full process. And then the other one is this TA lead sample job description, which is just something we've generated to give us an idea of the types of work that a TA leader is potentially doing in different companies. This is obviously going to vary depending on the organization, but just to give us something to actually play around with in this sandbox environment so we can actually get started on developing this. So what we're going to do is the first part, we're going to walk through the prompts that I think you can use in order to run this analysis. Now, I think the prompts are going to help you to do the analysis or at least get started, but I think you really want to use your own human judgment in addition to that so that you can not just completely trust what AI is telling you, but actually apply what you know about the organization and the expectations from the management team moving forward. And that's actually going to allow you to give a much stronger recommendation when we get to the end of this. So let's get started with the first prompt. And what we're actually going to do is go through this 4-part series, and this is part 1. We're actually going to break down the roles that currently exist in the organization into different jobs and tasks, and then actually measure how much time is allocated to each task and how much of that task can be automated using different AI tools. And we're not going to go into depth on the AI tools that we're going to use to automate. It's more of kind of a high level. And then what you would probably follow up with then is more of a deep dive into how can I actually automate this task, or how can I support the person who's doing this task with a copilot or with an additional tool that's going to help them to get more capacity and not require additional headcount overall to kind of grow with the organization. So the first one I'm going to do is actually look at task inventory extraction, and I'm going to paste all this in here directly. So I'm just going to copy the prompt. You can do this yourself in whatever tool you use. I really like to use Claude. I'm going to drop down to Sonnet 5 just to save a heavy user of Claude and Anthropic. What we're doing here is building a task inventory for workforce analysis. And you'll see the kind of rules that we've laid out there. We want to export a table. We want to make sure it's not actually doing the analysis for us, but actually really just extracting. What we're going to do is pull in the sample JD from here so that we can actually have something to start with. You see the rules here. We're going to output a table. The job description is actually how it's designed. What we're going to do is start to think about how do we actually perform the job. Now, classically, what you would do is more of like a work time study where you might observe what a person does in a given day and week, and then try and analyze all the different tasks, break them down, maybe over the course of a long period of time. We're going to make some inferences and just try and understand a little bit more about what does this person do day to day, week to week. Obviously, if it's your role, you can look back at your calendar and actually just extract your calendar and put it in. If you've gone through some of the other modules that we have where you actually automate your day-to-day workflow and actually start your day in Claude or in AI, you're probably already having that AI agent manage your calendar for you. And so you can actually stay on top of the kind of day-to-day that you're doing. And that might be a good way to actually get started with this. We're going to aim for 20 to 40 tasks. What we actually want to do is not just say, okay, we spend a third of our time doing this, third this. We actually want to go down to the actual tasks, go deeper. We don't actually want to go fewer than 15 or more than 50. What we'll actually see, I think, as we go through this is that's maybe not the kind of right setup, but we will kind of take a look at what we get out at the end, estimate volumes in hours, and then do not score, rank, or evaluate, because we don't actually want to go through the steps ourselves so that we understand what we're asking, what the output is, and we can actually explain it and defend it to a board member if we are actually briefing this to somebody. So let's take a look at what we've got back. So tasks from the job description, how often are they doing this per month, hours and total hours per month, and what the actual description is. And so you can see here there's a whole bunch of different tasks that we've outlined. You can see it does come up with a lot of different tasks. And so there's 33 tasks here. Adding on a few additional tasks that we're probably going to want to be doing that maybe are not included in the job description. So this is where we want to analyze what we actually do, not what we said we're going to do when we wrote the job description. And so right now we have 46 tasks, which is fits in our 20 to 40 roughly. We have 13 flag tasks, and these are the ones that we know we probably do, but we don't necessarily know if these are the kind of tasks that we're actually going to mandate. Actually, when we go through this, what we want to do is actually paste this into a spreadsheet, then go down and then adjust the number of hours that we're spending, how often we're doing that each month. So we get our total hours per month. And then if we sum that total hours per month, it should give us a rough approximation of how many hours we work per month. You could use 160 as a baseline. That's 4 weeks at 40 hours a week. You add mandatory training and lunches and everything else on top. And it's probably just a low ball estimate. I know a lot of people who maybe work 80 hours a week, and so we may want to double that. For the purposes of this exercise, we'll use 160 hours per week as an assumption. Now, when we actually kind of move forward, we do have the kind of second prompt here. If you do have real exports, this is where if you have Claude managing your calendar, or you can actually export your actual calendar, you can use this second prompt. What we're going to do is skip ahead to prompt 3, where we're actually going to start to think about how do we score across these 4 dimensions. There's 4 things that we care about: frequency and volume, whether the task is rule-based or judgment-based, how easy it is to digitize the inputs to that task, and how exposed may we be to error in that task. The reason these 4 are really important is because frequency and volume just gives us the overall kind of amount of hours that we're going to spend each month. But the other 3 are really helping us to understand whether this is a task that we should be looking to AI to automate, or whether this is something we should really keep as kind of human judgment. And rule-based versus judgment is a good one, where we know that AI can follow rules very, very clearly, and if there's not really much variation or not much judgment applied, even the base models can actually accomplish that fairly well. The input digitization is helpful because AI works in numbers, and so if you can take an input, whether that's a kind of an interview scorecard where everyone is submitting numbers, or it's like a scheduling tool where you have a time period that the candidate's available, a time period that the interviewer is available, and all you're trying to do is digitize and match those two. And then error tolerance is a really important one. If we think about something where we don't really care if we get it wrong, or it's not as important, so there's no legal risk, there's not a huge candidate experience risk. In fact, some of the time we actually want to automate because it's going to give a better candidate experience, because they don't have to wait for feedback or scheduling from an individual. But we really care a lot about that, because that's going to really dictate how we want to think about automating that specific task. And so you can see here that we're starting to outline this, and we can see how across these 4 dimensions we've actually started to score this now. So something like weekly one-on-ones with direct reports, it is quite frequent, weekly, and then there's no rule-based, it's not really digitized, and we do have a very low tolerance for, I guess I wouldn't necessarily agree that we don't really care about error with weekly one-on-ones. We might suggest that the one-on-ones are important, but if we get it wrong, then it's not going to have a huge impact. But I actually think as a manager, you probably care a lot more about whether you're having a kind of a really positive experience with that individual, and you're coaching them and developing them. So when you're actually going through the output here, you may actually want to adjust some of these on the fly, so that you're not just taking whatever AI says, and you actually want to adjust it to what you're determining yourself. Chasing hiring managers for interview feedback. It's moderate volume, but you can set up email scheduling. This one here, coordinate interview logistics, is a big one. There's already a lot of scheduling software out there. It's high volume, should be digitized. There is some human input for last minute conflicts, but for the most part, routine interview scheduling should probably be automated. And so you can see how we're actually now starting to think about what is the impact if we do start to automate these tasks, and then we're actually going to look at the big picture and figure out how many hours do we get back each month if we do start to go down that path. we have our flag tasks in here that weren't included on the job description, but we did infer based on what we know about a TA leader's role. Now we're going to do a really important part, which is we're actually going to audit the process. And so, as I said before, we don't always want to one-shot AI tools. What we want to do is actually use a step-by-step process and have control over the process that the tool is following. Even if we actually have AI develop the process itself first, as we're going through, if we understand what it's doing and we're actually interrogating each output, we actually kind of converge on a much better overall final product than if we were to just say, hey, give me an overall impact of how AI is going to affect my team. Here's an Excel download of my team. Just tell me who I'm going to fire is a terrible way to go about this. And so we want to make sure that we are fully in control of this process. We're a human in the loop and not we're just observing what's happening from afar. And so what we're doing here is a 3-pass audit check. First, we're going to argue against the 3 highest readiness tasks. So this is to make sure that we don't just assume that we're going to automate something. We want to understand, we want it to make a case for why we're going to edit that. And this is actually probably the same case that we're going to make if we're going to brief this to a board member or if we're going to create a slide deck. Do we actually think that those errors on D4 is greater than equal to 4 is actually correct? And we'll see what it comes back with. And pass 3 is the 3 scores where confidence is the lowest, and that gives us a way to actually investigate that. Now, because we're doing this with just one role to start with, and we've got a little over 40 overall tasks, we could actually go through line by line and manage this process ourselves. But if you imagine doing this for an entire organization, this kind of first sweep, if we're just looking at high level overall impact, can actually help us to get some kind of first pass analysis done, especially if we use one of the more powerful models like Fable, where we can actually have that spend a lot of time doing analysis and reasoning. We actually inject these kind of audit checks. And so the final product that we're going to get there is probably going to be a little bit more appropriate for what we would want. And then we can actually start to kind of go a little bit deeper and run the analysis. So you see we're starting kind of broad with the overall impact. And at each stage, we're going to get a little bit more granular. So we really understand what we're actually going to do kind of when we go through this process of reallocating headcount. And so first pass, weekly funnel report, D3, assume ATS data is clean, structured input. Anyone that's worked in ATS knows that's probably not the case. It probably requires a little bit more human intervention just to make sure something doesn't go wrong. Obviously, if you schedule the interview incorrectly, you can give a really bad candidate experience or potentially miss one of the interviewers off. And so everyone's rebuilding their whole calendar around this interview, and then you have one person not show up for it. It's a terrible candidate experience and actually could lead to you losing the candidate if the rescheduling window is then pushed out quite far. So this is just kind of the high readiness sanity check, error tolerance, intake calibration meeting. So we're now just looking through each of these and trying to determine, is this actually something that we don't really care about if we get wrong, or is this something that we're going to have to focus on? So we're kind of just looking through this. We're not going to go into too much depth here. Lowest confidence score, structured interview guide. We don't know if these are standardized or not. Design the interview panel and route offer for internal approval. And so you can see these 3, I would say, are normally the things that a recruiting ops leader would really focus on and develop over time. And so as the organization is figuring out how to best interview and hire people, there's going to be constant improvements in these processes. So just thinking about fully automating that without having gone through that process is probably not a good place to start. And so this is really just, giving you some things to look at in more depth. But frankly, if you're going to go through this process, I would actually want you to go line by line, look at everything and try and determine how we're going to score these more accurately. So the corrected table, you can see it's made a couple of changes. Sourcing passive candidates for personal rec. We don't have a low tolerance for errors. We actually want some good candidates. The funnel reports, again, we want that to be accurate. Interview logistics, we don't care if we do care if we do make some errors there. Same with rescheduling and everything else. So that's giving us that kind of like first audit check, like, did we actually get this scoring right? But let's move on and actually start to get to the final part of this process where we're actually going to score all of these tasks into quadrants. And so there's 4 quadrants that we think about. There are tasks that we can automate now, which means these are ready for AI automation. There's no point in a human doing it. There's tools readily available, and we should just move forward and automate those processes. There's copilot tasks where the task is actually achieved more effectively if there's a human with a copilot involved, where you can actually have someone working with AI to improve their overall capacity, their overall output, and actually get their role done a little faster. There's one which is redesign later, where there is some scope to potentially digitize the process, but it's not quite ready yet. Either the tools are not available or the amount of judgment that's required is not at a level where we're comfortable to just completely hand this off. And so that's something that we might want to think about, maybe with a process redesign rather than just handing it over to AI. And then the final quadrant is human core, where this is something that humans should always do. We're not going to automate this. This requires human judgment or human touch. And so we want to kind of keep those away from AI. We've kind of taken what was a role that we would traditionally hire for, broken down all of the 44 tasks that role would normally do, and try to think about which of those tasks should that person not be doing, and how can we then kind of rebuild that into a future role for this individual. So you can see here we've got the 4 quadrants: automate now, copilot, human core, redesign later. So 2 of the tasks should be fully automated, 24 should be copilot, 20 human core, and then none for a later redesign. And so what this is saying is that we can actually recover 32 hours a month or 20 FTE. Now this is interesting because a lot of the kind of analysis or the reporting you'll hear talks about how about 20% of roles will be automated. What we've shown here is it's not the role, it's 20% of the tasks that role does. And so when you think about this across a large organization, you have 100 roles, and each of those have 40 different tasks. So you've got 4,000 overall tasks that this organization is doing. If you're going to automate 800 of those tasks and actually free up 20% of FTE, then you're going to actually start to think about how you're going to redesign the workforce in order to take advantage of the extra capacity that AI is going to give you, and then how do you reallocate your resources in that new world. That's something we're going to cover in a later session. What we're actually going to do now is walk through how you present this analysis in an Excel sheet and how you might want to think about moving forward with that. So let's pull the Excel sheet up. Again, this is in the prompt pack that you're going to get, and so you'll be able to walk through this yourself. We've gone through the detail of each of the phases, so I'm just going to show you how this might look when you look at the overall talent acquisition team. This is using the demo, one of the use cases that we have in the Talent Academy, where we actually walk through live sessions on how you, as a talent leader, might want to be using AI more in your day-to-day in order to make more effective decisions. And so what we've done is actually gone through this task inventory across a whole team. So this is a team of 5, and you can see the kind of different roles and tasks. Again, we've kind of summarized these at a more high level just to make it a little easier to communicate. But how many instances are we doing this per month? How many hours per instance? And then total hours per month. Now, the thing to check here is, again, like with the individual, where we actually want those total number of hours to add up to about 160. Now with a team of 5, we actually want it to add up to about 800. And so we can see here that the implied capacity is 5 times 160. And then the sum of the total hours per month, again, is adding up to 800. So we know we've kind of got this first part roughly right. When we move forward into the rubric, this is just putting some context around the prompt that we went through earlier, where we're looking at the dimensions and the level of the dimensions that we're kind of analyzing. And we have the kind of rule-based decision tree here. So depending on how well we score and whether we care about errors, we may or may not want to automate this process. And so once we actually go through those stages, we get to our overall scoring, and we can see here how we've actually broken this with a Claude, so I'm going to hide that. We actually go through each of these 15 tasks that we kind of summarized and where we actually think about automating those tasks. And so you can see we have the AI ready to D4. These are the different dimensions that we were talking about, and then the frequency and volume number. And what we're actually doing is scoring whether this sits in a quadrant that we automate now, in a copilot quadrant, redesign, or human core. And you can see it pretty much follows the kind of the overall high level score. And when we actually plot that out onto a dashboard, what we can see is we start at the quadrant right now. So we have automate now, copilots, redesign later, and human core. We can see where these all land. So the things that we should automate now are on the right hand side here. So interview scheduling and coordination, ATS data entry and status updates, interview confirmation and reminders, and job posting and distribution. So chances are, if you're in a modern talent acquisition function, you've probably already automated most of these processes already. But this is really where AI can really shine, because you don't need an individual to be doing a lot of those. What's I think is quite interesting is the copilot area. So how can I actually use the copilot to help me with some of these tasks in order to automate some of the more administrative side of the task, so I can focus on the human element where I can really add a lot of value. So sourcing, outreach, and follow-ups, maybe you're using sourcing to build your initial top of funnel, and then you're actually sending those kind of one-on-one communications. Maybe using co-work to actually help you draft emails, which is what I do a lot in my kind of day-to-day as well. You want to have kind of a human take a look at what's happening here. You don't want to fully automate it. I think one thing that was quite interesting is this offer letter generation. Now, depending on the model you use, the offer letter generation may be pushed to fully automate now, because it seems like something that is done routinely every month. But the likelihood that you get that wrong, even if small, means that you actually have a huge legal issue, a huge kind of experience issue, and maybe a huge financial cost as well. So this is something which I wouldn't fully automate, but I actually think about what is the templatized approach that I can repeat each month, and where are the sources of data that I can pull from, such that the offer letter is generated and then a human takes a look and makes sure that everything is correct based on what we expect. There's no hallucinations in there where someone's going to get a benefit that doesn't exist. Reference checks is something to redesign later. I'm not going to go into that. And then fully human core phone screens, we don't want to outsource those, although some people would argue about AI phone screens. I don't believe in that. Actually conducting the interviews, again, we actually want a human-to-human interaction there. Interview debriefs and decisions, this is human judgment. We could automate part of it and actually use interview data to help inform that, but the actual debrief and decision making itself should never be automated. A hiring manager intake and calibration, again, that's something you could send them a form, but you're never going to capture everything. A good recruiter is always going to get the best information out of their hiring manager when they do a one-on-one, and actually extract that and figure out what they're looking for. And candidate negotiation and closing, do you actually just want two bots negotiating with each other, or do you want a human-to-human interaction where you're potentially going off script to try and understand what that person is looking for with their future role? And so we can see that we have 190 hours per month that we should automate now. Recoverable is actually just taking how much of the work still requires some human oversight, so that we're not saying we're going to fully automate this task because someone's still got to be responsible for it. But a large proportion of that should just go to AI with human oversight. And what we've done is actually, across these 15 tasks, we've found 220 hours per month that's recoverable. FTE equivalent is 1.4 and 28% of the team capacity. And so the way that we actually frame this is we don't say we found 220 hours of exposed capacity and here's where we're redeploying it into. And that's a teaser for what we're going to get to a little bit later, where we're actually thinking about what do we do with this extra capacity, and how do we think about the transition from doing this heat map to actually the change management and the implementation to an overall organization. This is the first in the 4-part series. So if you want to make sure that you get the next part when it's released, please subscribe below. If there's anything that you want me to go a little bit deeper on, please drop a comment below as well. I read all of them. It's really helpful as we're redesigning content and everything that we do at the Talent Academy. If you want to go a little bit deeper on some of these topics, the Meander Talent Academy, you'll find the details in the description, covers a lot of this analysis, and we actually do a lot of training. Many of the courses are also allowed for SHRM PDCs, so if you are trying to keep your credential, that's a good way to actually build that up. So look forward to hearing from you, and look forward to the next part in the series. Thank you.